Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Julia Chafers, and I'm a summer scholar working with the Century Foundation and Next 100, and I'll be moderating today's panel. So today's event is about what colleges must learn from the pandemic. So as we move into the future of higher education after the pandemic, how can we make it more equitable and more supportive for students across emergency funding, mental health, and creating policies. So we'll start by introducing today's panelists. We have Isabel Banda, a higher education summer scholar with the Century Foundation, Peter Granville, the senior policy associate with the Century Foundation, Lydia Larimore, the editorial and communications summer scholar with the Century Foundation, and Dr. James Pope, associate professor and program coordinator for Africana Studies at Winston-Salem State University. So if each panelist could introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how their work or experience relates to today's panel.
Hello, everybody. My name is Isabel. As Julia said, I am the higher education summer scholar with the Century Foundation, and I recently graduated from Brandeis University, and I worked extensively with first generation and low income students throughout their first year through college and also their first year in college in a pandemic. So yeah.
Hi, my name is Peter Granville, and I'm a senior policy associate here at the Century Foundation, and I study policies relating to college access and affordability. Before coming to TCF, I was an academic coach at Haverford College, which is right outside of Philadelphia. I'm very excited to be here today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lydia Larimore, and I am the editorial and communication scholar at the Century Foundation right now. And I just graduated from Spelman College this spring, and I'm heading to law school in the fall. So student care matters a lot to me. I was also a peer tutor at Spelman for 3 years, working with students who come from really marginalized school districts.
And that's me. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. James Pope, and I guess my contributions is that I'm a professor at HBCU. And I've been teaching. I've actually taught at Howard University, Georgetown University, and also Virginia Commonwealth University. So I think I have a range of experience and a range of access to different types of students.
Awesome. Thank you all for telling us a little bit about yourselves. So we'll start by talking about emergency and support funds. So this question will start with Peter and Isabel. So a major impact of the pandemic was the increased financial challenges that students faced. How did universities increase support for students over the past year, and how can we continue these policies into the future?
Sure. Well, let me start by putting some numbers to these financial challenges. Some survey research from the Hope Center found that during fall of 2020, last year, nearly 3 in 5 students experienced basic needs insecurity in some form. This includes more than 29% of students experiencing food insecurity, 48% of students experiencing housing insecurity, and even 14% of students experiencing homelessness. Those who have been the hardest hit include a lot of vulnerable populations, particularly Black students, Indigenous students, LGBT students, female students, and first generation students. These numbers were all high before the pandemic, and they only worsened. But despite these challenges, colleges really did step up their financial support for students during the pandemic in a number of ways. In some cases, they gave out laptops to students who needed them to continue learning remotely. Financial aid offices help students access a process called professional judgment, which is basically how you can adjust your FAFSA information to account for a job loss in your family, for example, which is really important when unemployment is nearly 15%. Campus food pantries found ways to deliver meals to students even under social distancing guidelines, or even help students connect to SNAP benefits. But I think most importantly, colleges delivered emergency grants for students with the help of Congress. So Congress passed a really unprecedented amount of emergency aid for students this year, totaling about $32 billion over the past year and a half. So that's a really big amount. And actually, even before COVID, we knew that emergency aid can have this profound experience or this profound impact on students. As I mentioned earlier, before I came to TCF, I worked in the dean's office at Haverford College, and I was primarily an academic coach there, but I also did an evaluation of the school's emergency aid program for low-income first-generation students. And when I did that evaluation, I was struck at how much a grant of $300 or $500 can make such a difference for a student. I remember speaking with a student who was, she had received very little financial support from her family, and her education was nearly put on hold due to illness, not COVID, but actually depression and anxiety. And she received money from this program to cover her food and living expenses while she took time away from her on-campus job. That allowed her to focus more on herself and her courses. And without that money, she really didn't know what she would have done to just balance all of these things that were going on in her life. So that helped her complete the semester and actually get a lot out of the final weeks of that semester. So that's just one example of the kind of impact that emergency aid can have. So actually, before the pandemic, emergency aid programs like that were not on every campus, and they were oftentimes quite small. One analysis found that about half of existing programs had budgets under $10,000 a year. So in the future, I think Isabel will tee this up a little bit, Congress should view emergency aid as a core piece of the financial aid framework and continue to send money to schools in the way that they have. And I guess here's my perspective on why they should. Emergency aid kind of compensates for this limitation in our financial aid system. So when you file a FAFSA and you receive your aid, the system is assuming your income isn't going to change very much and that your costs are going to be close to what your college expects them to be. But that's really not how life works. You could lose a job, your spouse might lose a job, or your parents might. You can have a sudden medical expense, you could spill water on your laptop, you might need a root canal procedure. All of these things happen, and they've happened to all of us at one point in time or another. So we need a financial aid system that accounts for the fact that these things can happen to students, and they can happen very suddenly. So this is all to say, I think large-scale emergency aid is a really important step in the evolution of financial aid in the country. It makes a system better able to meet students where they are, which is at the intersection of family and health and life.
Okay. I will say that as a senior during the pandemic at a predominantly white university and being first generation and low income, the Higher Education Relief Fund was very, very, very helpful for me. And I would kind of attribute my completion of college to that during the pandemic. And as Peter said, this piece of legislation is based on the premise that COVID-19 severely reduced some students' ability to support themselves and fund any other number of expenses, from tuition to daily living expenses. However, we know that students experience personal crisis all the time that reduce or limit their ability to financially support themselves throughout college. Thus, Congress should make this program a permanent feature of the higher education landscape. All students should have access to a pool of emergency grants that they can apply to and receive to cover any expenses that they choose. And I will say that aside from the HERF grant and all the federal funding, I was at Brandeis University, and Brandeis University had an emergency fund that students could also access once these grants were given at certain times of the year, so those would run out. So I would also encourage other institutions to look into starting an emergency fund or continue to invest in those. I will say that those kinds of emergency funds is what helped me and my peers and some of my students cover stuff that was outside of college, like Peter mentioned, job loss expenses, medical expenses, technology, and even housing. The students' financial need and FAFSA are considered when they apply. And as someone who benefited from this type of emergency funding, I think we should continue to invest in similar kinds of funds.
You both touched a little bit on this, but could you talk about how the federal government is important as opposed to leaving it to colleges to kind of create these funds? Like, why is it important that the federal government's the one to support these programs?
Yeah, well, I think the number one thing is the federal government just has more money to work with. And I think if anyone can jump in at a time of crisis, like the pandemic, for example, it's certainly Congress. And I guess when it comes to what Congress should do as they're making this money, as they're appropriating this money for students, lawmakers attach a lot of strings to financial aid. So depending on the scholarship, you need a certain GPA, or you need to be enrolled in a certain course of study, or you may even have to pass a drug test I'm actually not joking about that. The state of Kentucky makes students pee in a cup to access a free tuition program, which is quite wild. So establishing these hoops for students to jump through is, I think, bad policy in general. I think the policy should be, if you need the money for college, you should be able to get it. But I think this is especially true for emergency aid because it's money that you need right now. So when Congress, hopefully in the future, does appropriate emergency aid, it should establish as few restrictions on that aid as possible and make the process straightforward. As an example of what the federal government should not do, the Education Department last year added a lot of confusion to the CARES Act emergency aid. The department initially said any student could get the funds, and then they said a few weeks later, you must be eligible to participate in Title IV, which ruled out many students, including undocumented students. And then colleges asked, okay, can students certify their eligibility without having to fill out the FAFSA, which is notoriously long. It's 100 questions right now. And it just led to a lot of confusion. The department took weeks to respond to those kinds of concerns, and I'm pretty sure students suffered because of it. So in my opinion, simplicity is the way to go.
And I will also add that I worked with students all across the nation. I worked with a nonprofit from Houston, Texas, with 30 students who were entering their first year of college at different institutions. And I will say that the role that the federal government should play in this is that, like, especially like Peter said, like adding some kind of structure and regulations to this, because I did see kind of like difference in support between my students depending on what institutions they were at. And they were at, some of them were at private universities, some of them at private, public, some of them 2 years, some of them 4 year. So I think this is a very good way to ensure that all students receive some type of aid, and it's all like regulated and based off of your FAFSA and your need, really.
Thanks. So now we'll move into grading policy issues. So another major change during the pandemic was how colleges adjusted their grading practices to be more flexible in many cases. So as we move beyond the pandemic and into the next year, what should colleges learn from this period about how to best assess students, and what practices should they maintain or change moving forward? So we can go to Dr. Pope or Lydia, whoever wants to start us off there.
I'll defer to Lydia if she don't mind. I'll come in.
Sure, I can start. So I think what we learned from kind of the grading policy changes, which a lot of schools went to pass-fail, some version of credit, no credit. Some schools decided that you could opt in. That's what my institution did. Spelman gave us an opt-in for pass-fail for all of our classes for the first semester, and then kind of moderated versions of that for the rest of the year and the rest of the pandemic experience. And some schools did just complete pass-fail for all students. And I think we learned a couple of things from this experience, which is that grading is, first of all, super subjective, just because it's very reliant on the course, on the professor, and professors have a lot of discretion in how they grade things and what their grading policies are. Like at my school, we don't even have one grading scale. For some professors, an A starts at a 95. For others, it starts at a 93, and others, it starts at a 90. So it's just really different from across all different professors and disciplines. But we also learned that it's also not necessarily reflective of students' capacity to learn or to perform. And it's often not indicative of what other challenges or struggles students are going through at the time. And so grading is a highly subjective and a not always great indicator of student performance. But grades are also still really important. So I know a lot of students at my school wanted us to have not an opt-in policy, but just a complete pass-fail policy, because they thought it would look badly on students who chose the pass-fail if some students weren't. But me, I was applying to law school at the time. And as a student coming straight out of undergrad with not a lot of work experience, my grades were a really important part of that process. So I took no pass-fail credits for the entirety of the pandemic because I didn't want law schools to look at that and not have really an accurate indicator of my performance. And at the same time, I was really lucky. Like I could come home to a safe environment where I could learn. I had reliable Wi-Fi. I had parents who were supportive. So my circumstances weren't indicative of all circumstances. And so because of the subjective and really variable nature of grading, I think that we need to look at ways outside of just like the mere grading policies that individual professors use to really help students. And so one way to do that is to hold professors accountable to a more institutional grading scheme. Like I said, right now, professors have a lot of influence over what the grades are in their class, how the syllabus is set up, even the grading scale that they're using. And so by creating a more official and objective way of grading and evaluating syllabi, assignments, grading policies, we can give students the ability to hold professors accountable for what they say, hold professors accountable for the conditions that are currently in play in either the students' lives or the broader environment, and also just make students feel like their institutions are there to support them and actually care about what's going on in their lives. I got lucky. I had professors who were very accommodating and who really understood that the pandemic was hard and did their best to make sure that their expectations were clear and reasonable. But a lot of students didn't get that lucky. And so taking some of that power out of the disaggregated hands of professors and into the institution's hands, I think would be really helpful.
Wow. As the actual professor sitting on this panel, I hear a lot in what you guys are doing. I hear a lot of validity in what you guys are doing. But I wanted to kind of add to this conversation and take this conversation a little bit into a different direction as far as like your policies and as far as like what Lydia's talking about, the subjectivity and grading, the numbers and things like that. I think as far as grading is concerned, let me just approach it. Lydia's right. Generally, professors at most universities generally look at grading as, quite frankly, a punitive tool. Based upon repeating information, making sure that you think in a certain particular way, making sure that you kind of conform to the classroom or to the decor of the classroom that the professor is teaching. Institutions generally do have a policy, including my institution. We're part of a system, and there's a general policy where there are things that you must place onto the syllabus. There are things that you must include on the syllabus as far as like access to different types of services for students. But again, I think that, for me, and now let me just jump to the way that I approach grading or that I approach my classroom. I approach students as human beings first. I do not look at anybody that come into my classroom as a student because I consider myself, just because I have these letters behind my name, or just because I've written or spoken across the world, I'm a learner as well, because I'm sitting here learning from you guys. I think I should be the one kind of like listening to you guys and your experiences, particularly from Brandeis and particularly from the dean's office, and Lydia, of course, going to Spelman, which is a sister HBCU. I teach at HBCU myself, so there are also a number of issues. Okay, as far as grading is concerned, until we address the foundational philosophy of education in the United States, particularly a system in the United States of education is built upon an antiquated model. Rooted in the myths of meritocracy, individualism, and education versus training. I think that's very important. And you see this dichotomy between education and training at HBCUs more so than predominantly white universities. But what ends up happening is that the grading system that is based upon this philosophical system that is rooted in all of these myths that I just talked about, particularly this individualism, the myth of individualism. It creates class differences. It exacerbates racialized barriers that students are not necessarily equipped to face once they leave the university. Don't matter whether you're HBCU or a predominantly white university. But more importantly, these limited conceptualizations of gender that are encapsulated in the grading system itself. So fundamentally, for me as a person who has written on this issue of, as far as education, particularly looking at it from the perspective of HBCUs, I think there's an elephant in the room here is that we're talking about education in this broad category and not keeping into consideration that there is different types of education and different types of policies and for specific purposes, from elite universities to middle universities. And of course, you have the outliers here of this capsulation of what you call HBCUs there. So for me, grading, interestingly enough, right before the pandemic, I was moving away from grading. And I know my university is probably going to see this and probably I'm gonna get emails and all this other particular stuff. But I personally do not like the grading model based upon, this point system, because to me, it reconceptualizes and creates a cyclical model of these myths that individuals. So what I tried to do, what I didn't have to shift much into my grading policy as far as like extending grace. People call it extending time but I extend grace because I was going through a pandemic just like everybody else was. And I was very, very clear about that with my students. And I was saying, give me grace when you're submitting something. Give me time to I may not have, been able to grade it based upon the fact that I've had a lot of things that changed in my life as well. So grading, I think it should be a holistic process. And I think that there should be, for me, coming from the professor side and just a little bit of the administration side, there should be more a training or some type of support for professors to really break out of this disciplinary model of the classroom, creating this power relation between the student and the professor. And I think that professors need to be reminded of the fact that they were in the places of these students at one particular point in time as well. So for me, I try to create an environment, and I have created an environment that is a classroom that I don't even consider to be a classroom. I say it's an ideas lab. When we come into class, we're dealing with ideas, arguments, and we're trying to develop a way that students, particularly students that come to my classroom at the HBCU, to move in a global economy that's really designed against the very being of students of African descent, students of Latino descent, poor students, because that's fundamentally what's the question here. What are we producing out of our classrooms? So if we're still reproducing this antiquated model of grading based upon this individualism, this myth of meritocracy, the idea of educating and training that create these class differences that exacerbates these racialized barriers in the classroom itself, then what we're actually doing is just kind of reproducing the same power relations that we also are trying to say that we're training our students or educating our students to actually address once they're out of the classroom. So for me, I didn't have to change much. The only thing I did have to do is provide a little bit more access to different types of multimedia projects, because one of the things that I like to do with my students is to get students to produce things that go beyond the classroom. So when they're writing a paper, I tried to get them to produce something like an Adobe Spark page, or something that is a little bit more multimedia, that it can travel with them. They can put it on their resume. They go to grad school and somebody says, what did you do? It's not a paper that's sitting, in my office, because I think we got to keep papers for a certain amount of time. You should see the stacks of papers. I'm gradually throwing stuff away, but I'm like, let's make this into a more digital and more multimedia that more people can access it. Because for me personally, I stand at the nexus between community and also academia. So most of my life is spent organizing communities, particularly on the continent of Africa and in Latin America, of African descent, around human rights. So I bring that type of mentality into the classroom. So for me, I didn't have to pivot much. A number of my close colleagues didn't have to pivot much, because we have the same, we actually fight against education within the education system. What I mean is the philosophy of education that is currently organized is that I try to really work against. There's Stefan Harney and Fred Moten, who wrote a book called The Undercommons that I recommend that everybody go get, to really understand what we're really doing is kind of working against this antiquated philosophical system of education that is reproducing the power relations that becomes cyclical, not only in our classroom, but also in society. So I'll pause there because I can go on and on about this. And also, I kind of feel, I was feeling all flushed just now when you guys were talking about grades. I was like, are they talking about me? All this other ridiculous stuff, but no, I definitely extend grace. Students, and I also allow students to pick and choose the assignments that they would like to do, but their final assignment must be a culmination of what they've learned the entire semester. So for me, I'm an abolitionist. So I want to abolish grades. I want to abolish college tuition. I want to abolish prison. I'm an abolitionist in this total sense. So for me, let's get rid of grades for me. So I'm good with it. And also provides less grading for me. But anyway, let's just get rid of grades.
Yeah, I will say that the paper that I am proudest of writing in my entire higher education career thus far is a paper that I wrote in a class with the most lenient and grace-giving grading policy. I worked incredibly hard in that class, but that's because I had an excellent professor who was teaching something that was really interesting and who gave me the grace when I needed to work a little bit more on an outline, when I needed to work a little bit more on an idea, and talk to me through those ideas over and over again. And so ultimately I got an A in the course, and it's an A that I feel like I really earned. But the reason that kind of work was possible was because I wasn't feeling pressured to produce for the sake of producing. I was feeling the room and the freedom and the creativity to go after an idea that I really cared about and explore it in its entirety. And so I don't think that giving more grace and grading is something that will hurt students. I think it can inspire them to do their best work. And at the same time, it was important that I got a letter grade in that class because I needed all of the very nice law schools that I was applying to think, oh, she's smart. That was important to me. That was important to my application. And so I think it's really important that we don't do abolition of grading or anything else in the vacuum, because when the institutions that students are applying to and seeking entry to are still really relying on those metrics to decide who gets in and who doesn't, when grading is still a gatekeeping mechanism for the places that students want to go, grading is going to be important. And so that's why I'm really focused on creating more fair and equitable ways of grading students until we can get to a place where grading isn't such a big factor in getting to the places where students want to go.
Thank you, Lydia and Dr. Pope. It was really interesting to hear both the student and professor perspective on the issue of grading. We'll now move into our last little subtopic of mental health support. So Isabel and Lydia will weigh in on this, but the first question is, in what ways did the pandemic and the resulting stress that students face reveal gaps in colleges' mental health support systems? So in your experiences with the people you were advising, Isabel, or your personal experiences or your peers' experiences, or just a general awareness, because I know we've all kind of gone through the last year and a half in an environment where everyone was sort of struggling in different ways. But if you could speak a little bit to the gaps that you saw.
Yeah, of course. I will say living through a pandemic as a college student has been extremely difficult for both me and my students, and I'm sure many others. Many students at the beginning of the pandemic were forced to return to their homes as schools closed, and others were displaced in the process. And that's just one of the issues that students can face during the pandemic, and then the stress that comes from the pandemic. Your health, your family, everything on top of the stress that comes with being a college student can definitely take a toll on one's mental health. So in order to support students in need of mental and social support, the federal government should place strings on federal funds to encourage universities to invest in the creation of these mental health support services. And this could include confidential crisis reporting, individual or group counseling, extending project paper due dates, and then wellness checks on students who miss exams. I will say that my experience with my own students, like I said, these students are all over the country. And a common concern for them was actually finding these mental health support systems at their universities. So linking them to those offices if they did exist. So sometimes I would look into schools and they just didn't have much on their website for their counseling center if they had one. And also when they were available, some of them had limited availability, limited appointments. So getting an appointment was also a struggle that some of my students faced. And I just want to stress that as we transition back to normal, or whatever some people call the new normal, it's important for institutions to consider and prepare for their students' mental health needs. It definitely does take a toll on the students' performance, and it goes hand in hand with, the grading policies and all of that. So I think it's definitely should be at the forefront of universities' concerns as their students prepare to return to campus.
Yeah, I'll speak on a friend of mine's experience with mental health support systems and how they really failed him during the pandemic in a way really expensive and unfortunate way. So he was taking his senior thesis, the final semester, one of those big things you do before you graduate. And so to finish the senior thesis, you don't just have to present a senior thesis, you also have to meet with your professor a number of times. He worked really hard trying to meet with this professor, but schedules weren't aligning. It's really difficult to talk and just communicate virtually. It's just like, it's a difficult scenario. And at the same time, he was going through a lot of mental health challenges, like a lot of students, because it was a rough year. And he reached out to his school's counseling system multiple times and never received a response. He went through the pathways that are supposed to exist and that are supposed to help students, and there was just nothing on the other end. And so, long story short, he has to retake senior thesis next semester. He didn't graduate. It's expensive, it's hard. It means he doesn't get to move on with his life, with his friends and with his family. And that's just really unacceptable, that mental health was such a low priority for his school that it ultimately affected his academic performance. And he did finish his senior thesis, and he just didn't meet his professor enough times for it to count. And so that's really crazy to me, that those resources that were supposed to be there and that he did all the things that you're supposed to do just didn't back him up in that. And so I think that really clearly there, it's just like colleges actually have to care about this. They actually have to make these pathways not just accessible, but actually existent. Somebody has to answer the email or the phone on the other line. And so that is not something I think that's something that definitely like the federal government can help with, like Isabel said, by creating these strings that force colleges to create these pathways. But if those pathways aren't complete, and if colleges don't really care about them, they're still going to go to waste. So I think it's something that colleges have to actively prioritize and care about their students' well-being, and recognize that a student's well-being is central to their academic performance. You can't separate the two. If you're going to invest in one, you need to invest in the other, and it's not okay to just leave a student out in the cold.
Thanks for those commentaries. I also want to remind the audience that you can submit questions via the chat function, and we'll move into the Q&A in just a minute. But if Isabel and Lydia, you want to talk a little bit more specifically about what the government and universities can do to proactively support students' mental health, so being there all of the time, year-round, not just in times of crisis, so not just trying to scramble when we hit a pandemic and students are all kind of struggling, but what they can do to just be there all of the time whenever students are in need of support.
I think the most important action that universities and the federal government can take to support students' mental health year-round is to establish, or if these things already exist, reinvest in the mental health services on their campuses. Like I said, they're at some universities, they already have like a health center or a counseling center, but invest in having more therapists coming in, or have more resources for students, make appointments more available, make representation a thing amongst your therapists as well. Things like that, raising awareness on campus throughout the entire campus, not just at these offices, incorporate this into the learning, into, brief the professors on the resources that students can reach out to on campus. And just expanding those kind of programs and making them more widely accessible and affordable, with hopefully no out-of-pocket or direct costs passed along to students. I think that's the biggest and most important thing that universities and the federal government can do.
Yeah, and I think something else that colleges can do is recognize that mental health doesn't exist in a vacuum. Sometimes students are depressed because they're depressed, but oftentimes students are depressed because they're stressed, because they don't have enough money to cover this or that expense, because their housing situation is really bad, because they don't have enough food to eat. Caring about mental health means caring about the whole person and recognizing how all of the components of healthy living are non-existent, or the quality of that is like greatly reduced. We have to recognize the entire student. And because like in America, like when you're going to college, often you live on a college campus, you live near your college. College is your entire life. You're not home with your parents. You don't have a support system. You have to build that support system. And so I think colleges have to recognize that they're taking really vulnerable people in, people who are often low income, who are often in a lot of debt, who often don't have support systems in the schools that they're going to. And they have to be that support system. They have to care about things like, do my students have adequate housing? Do they have access to food? All of those things. And so having more wraparound services that address like the whole being, I think would be really, really helpful.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll now move into the Q&A section. So feel free to submit any questions you have on the issues we've talked about or anything else. But I'll start with a couple of pre-submitted questions while we wait for the audience questions to flow in. So first, if we could think about how equity factors into the policies that we've talked about so far, so how you can ensure that marginalized groups at universities are able to access, for example, the mental health services that we've talked about or the emergency support funds we've talked about. I'm going to keep like equity at the center of all of these considerations. Anyone can feel free to jump in on that.
Let me, if you guys don't mind, I would like to like just interject something here, particularly in all of your particular projects. And one of the things that I think about, you know, consistently is from a perspective of roots and then the stems of those roots. Everything that we're talking about here is based upon a conceptualization and a philosophy that we're using to address any type of policy recommendations, right? So if we do not address the overall system within which each one of these particular issues are emanating from, then we're spinning our wheels without having any clear understanding of a future. Or a future of education. And one of the things I wanted to, you know, kind of jump back to, you know, the grading part of this, and I mentioned this pretty early, is that education, particularly as way it's constructed today, is very traumatic. It's very violent. It is rooted in a colonial system of education that is literally based upon superiority, individualism, and all of those particular constructs of the way that the world is and the way that the world is not. So what I'm saying here is that if we don't have an idea or a radical imagination to envision an education system outside of this particular system within which we are living in this particular moment, jumping out there. Let me give you an example. I'm part of a group, and the reason why I say I'm an abolitionist, particularly for grades, I'm actually a part of a group that we're studying how to, part of a group at Duke University, no less, that is really studying how do we abolish these particular narrow conceptualizations of disciplines. Now, what I'm talking about is not new. Foucault talks about this. There are a number of people who've written on this particular idea. If you guys understand what the Fees Must Fall movement was doing in South Africa, what the decolonizing university movement was doing across Canada in relationship to Latin America, and also. So what I'm saying here is that the things that I've put on the table as far as kind of shifting the conversation from the symptoms and to trying to move to the root causes of mental health and the exacerbation of mental health, or the exacerbation of using a punitive system of grades, or a punitive system that is based upon these power relations of deconstructing the classroom. You know, even the classroom has a sense that when you come in, you have the professor there, he's standing in front, or she's standing in front, or they are standing in front, and they are speaking to students, right? They're telling you what you need to do. I teach differently. That's the reason why students love my classes, but they hate my classes, because the first thing I do is I do not tell you how to think. We deal with ideas and arguments. I don't allow students to tell me what they believe. I don't allow students to tell me what they think. I allow students to make arguments and to make assertive assumptions based upon a lineage or a genealogy of knowledge that they have brought with them to the classroom or that they have read. So what I'm saying here is that I'm not making these. There's critical resistance studies in the University of Massachusetts Amherst, who actually uses some of my work in their critical resistance study. So what I'm saying is that the way that we view education has shifted overnight. Education is literally not, we shouldn't think about education as just this institutional, individualized process or project. Everything we're talking about here is a collective process, whether it is, and one of the languages that I hear you guys using is what the school should do, what the government should do. What about the community? What about schools and collectives of different folk? Because I just said I'm part of a group that we're studying how to abolish grades. We're studying how to reconceptualize the university based upon the fact that I come from a tradition in Africana studies. Africana studies was not allowed to be taught. So Black history or African history and those types of things, we had to fight to get that on campuses, not only in Cornell, not only on PWIs, but even on HBCUs. So what we have to understand is that we have to demystify what education is. We have to remove this institutionalized, limited perception or conceptualization of what education is and move it into this collective process. Do I think, but that's with tenure and all these other type of things. And when you're talking about holding people accountable for grades or syllabus, you're going to run into a tenure issue, because a lot of professors who do that, they're going to do it simply because there's nothing that can be done about it because they're tenured, right? So we have to, which is another conversation I think you guys should have as well. It's like looking at that tenure process. I mean, we just saw what happened with North Carolina. Right. And also the fact that a lot of universities are moving away from tenure processes to be more punitive and also to extract more labor out of professors who do not get into these particular processes. So what I'm saying here is just to recapitulate here, is that if you're making policy decisions and you're making decisions based upon it, is important to rethink or to conceptualize or to rethink or critically engage in the methods, the philosophies, and the concepts and the language that you're using in order to develop some types of policies out of this. So that's pretty much my spiel, and I can answer anything specifically. But I just wanted to let you guys know, because I'm part of groups across the world. I would encourage you guys to look at the Fees Must Fall movement, particularly coming out the Rose Must Fall, particularly the decolonization movement. Our decolonizing university movement, the social justice and university. So there's work on this that are really reconceptualizing this institutionalized, limited perception of what education is. As we have it now, it's a myth. Meritocracy and advancing. I mean, Lydia talked about, you got to have grades. That is reconceptualizing power relations. If we're not thinking specifically but beyond these particular things, then the only thing we're doing is having meetings and meetings and meetings. And this is not the first meeting that has been done on this particular topic. Whether you guys do it, we do it, there's constantly people doing it. But I think it's time for us to be serious. I think it's time for us to be clear about our intentions to actually move towards the future of education. So.
Well, speaking of intentions, that kind of brings up something that I've been thinking about, which is that it's really hard to advocate on behalf of a population that doesn't trust you. And I think that there's a big lack of trust between college students and higher education institutions. Because college students aren't stupid. They know that higher education isn't just education, it's also a business. They know that colleges have balance sheets to run. And so I think a lot of the time when colleges say we're implementing this or implementing that, but they don't give some kind of explanation, some kind of transparent communication of why that decision is being made and how they expect it to affect students. Students recognize that sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly as a financial decision that isn't really that isn't invested in caring about their well-being. And so at the very least, I think that the communication pathways between students and admin need to be strengthened. And so on one end, that means listening to students with a broad range of experiences. So you really understand where the need lies on a particular campus, but it also means being transparent about why decisions are made. I imagine sometimes schools make decisions that are suboptimal for students, and that they have reasons to do that, and reasons that students might even understand. But as long as institutions aren't honest about that, what you're going to have students saying is, I pay tuition, I pay all of this money, and you're still doing these things that are wrecking my life. And I think that's really reasonable impulse to have, especially when you just don't have the information. So I think information sharing between admin and students is really important.
Does anyone else have anything on this question before we move on? Cool. Okay, in that case, we can move on to the next one. So what can professors, school administrators, staff, and I actually think, like Dr. Pope said, open up to the community and student body as well. What can all of these different groups work together to do to advocate for these policies or a broader change in the way we think about education?
Let me jump in here. There are models. This is when history becomes very important. And I know this is probably a dirty word for most people because most people think it's history as this linear process from one point to another. But history is a very messy process and it's cyclical. There are models that students and faculty, and to kind of piggyback off what Lydia is saying, is that professors are caught in the middle of all of whatever decisions, to meet the neoliberal university, the capitalist university, because that's what we have now. It is a business, and I agree with you. We're caught in the middle of all of this, right? So a lot of times, give you an example, there were things that was happening at my university that students were coming and asking me about that I had no clue, right? There was some money that was supposed to be given that they decided it was going to give these students, like, where can I get this money? I'm like, I don't know. Nobody said anything to me about it. I don't know. So what I'm saying is that I think that, and what I mean here is this, there's models here. So looking at the way that education, particularly in understanding the indigenous peoples movement, the Latino movement, and also particularly the Africana and Black Studies movement, what they were doing, particularly from the 1960s, all the way up until this day. I mean, because we're still trying to make sure that students are provided a well-rounded education that is rooted in their historical and ancestral experiences. Look at those models. Look at those models, historical models of students, whether it was the anti-war movement, whether there was things that was going on. Look at those models of the historical instances. And one of the things that you will see in those particular models to get administration to do what students want to do was a tight, clear collaboration between professors and the students. What I'm saying is that we have to think about organizing. Again, I'm an organizer, which is different than an activist, right? An organizer is a person who thinks about strategy and how do you put things together to meet a particular goal. So if you look at those, and that also means that you have to partner with the faculty who are on your side. And just like Lydia said, students, I know students are super smart, right? Students are super, not only do they know that decisions are being made, but they know when the professor actually really likes you, right? When you come into a class, you guys sit in classes and things like that. So what I'm saying is identify and build coalitions based upon the student and faculty who are, and faculty is a tricky thing because a lot of faculty are, I'm gonna be quite frankly, they're scared to even move in their particular spaces, but there are enough faculty out there. I have plenty of folk that I work with inside academia, but outside academia, build coalitions. And I mentioned this in earlier comments, this is a collective process. In order to get people that are considered to be in authority, and I don't say power because it's very important to understand that there are dimensions to power. That just having the power over and the power to do something does not mean that you have true power, because you also have to have power with and within. What I'm saying is that there's authority here. We have to understand in order to get people to stretch and be creative about their authority is that there always has to be a collective process, because no one individual or few individuals are going to beat an institution. Understand that you have to have a collective process. So there are models here. I would say, look at those movements. Again, I'll point to global movements. I just said the Trees Must Fall, Rose Must Fall, Decolonizing University, but also the historical movements of the indigenous peoples movement, the decolonizing, the curriculum movement. You know, those types of things are going to be very instructive in this particular period, more so than any other period, because the university are making decisions even more based upon that survival in this so-called post-COVID era. So I think that is important. Just look at the lessons of history. That will be very important. And they're not that far. I'm not talking like you got to go to ancient, history. We're only talking 20, 30, 40 years. So.
Okay, and we'll move to our last question. So if someone would like to speak about any colleges, universities that you've seen successfully implement the programs that we've talked about to support student learning, whether that be mental health, grading, or emergency funds, that we can look to, especially while transitioning past the pandemic.
Well, this is kind of an indirect answer to your question, Julia, but I want to, I guess, kind of give a shout out or some recognition to lawmakers in California. They've really been the state that's gone further than any other so far in integrating emergency aid into the financial aid framework, kind of in the way that I've talked about earlier on this panel. So for example, they provided aid for undocumented students when the DeVos administration said those students weren't eligible for the federal funds. And actually in both state budgets since the CARES Act, they've included state-funded emergency aid for students. And even at the university level, the UC, the University of California system, is, to my knowledge, the first public university system in the nation to have a basic needs hub on every campus. So this means students have some specific place to turn to on campus to get help with food, with housing, with financial aid, with mental health, assistance for applying for public benefits, and more. And even the most recent state budget included funding that would start developing a similar model at the state's community colleges. It's just a start, but it's certainly moving in that direction. So this is kind of an example of a state that's already taking the lessons we've been discussing here today, at least as it relates to emergency aid and basic needs, and working to scale them upwards. And certainly that's a really big project, even in an individual state, and a much bigger project nationwide. But I think it's a cool model to look at what they're doing.
And I wanted to add to that is that model was built off of the organizing of young folk that were on campuses and in communities who were developing those hubs. So what ended up happening was the state legislature was like, oh, well, hey, because again, it was a collective process. Again, I'm going to harp on this. It's not just one particular area, but that model that Peter's talking about was really based upon a lot of the organizing that students were doing on campuses, and at the same time, they were sending people to the California state system, who then obviously went to the state legislature. So that's exactly what I was talking. Thank you, Peter. You actually talked about what I was just saying a few minutes ago, is that there's a collective process here, and that those students who were organizing on campuses, along with professors and community organizations, because again, I was actually working with a few of those organizations in the community that were student-based as well, too. So.
I'll quickly shout out my soon-to-be home. Yale Law did create an emergency support fund for their students during the 2020 to 2021 school year, and it's now a permanent feature of their aid landscape. They should, because fun fact, Yale Law does require you to exhaust all of your savings and checkings in the first 2 years of attendance. So you don't have emergency funds. So that's definitely part of the reason that was instated, but I still think it's a really great model. And of course, like, Yale has those resources, which is why I think the federal government is really important in this, because not all schools are going to have the endowments of these big name institutions, especially the grad programs. So the federal government can play a really big role in extending those programs to all students.
Awesome. Well, before we close out, does anyone have any last thoughts on anything before we end? Awesome. Okay. So thank you everyone for attending today's panel. Before we close, I will just reiterate the policy recommendations that the scholars came up with that we've talked about throughout. So first, Congress making these emergency relief funds a permanent feature of aid landscapes so that students have access to emergency grants when they need it, not just in times of cataclysm like the pandemic. Second, on the point of grading flexibility, creating transparent and accessible and accountable mechanisms for grading practices that allow students to reduce the subjectivity of grading and be able to challenge unfair policies on the part of professors. And we also talked a little bit about thinking beyond even those schemes and thinking about what grading could look like in a broader sense. And then lastly, on the point of mental health support, the federal government providing funds with strings attached to encourage universities to invest in creating pathways to protect students' mental health year-round in a proactive manner, not just in times of crisis. So thanks again to our panelists for coming. Thank you for all the attendees for listening and asking questions. And a recording of the event will be made available on tcf.org, where you can also find out about future events that the Century Foundation has coming down the line. But thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.